think it says something about why there's an anti-politics movement in this
Another
country.
vote for Russell Brand. We'll leave it there. Now, the victims in last week's attack in Paris were of many religions, of course, and none. It was a Muslim police officer, Ahmed Merabet, who was among those shot by the terrorists. Of course, another Muslim helped some of those Jewish shoppers who were cowering in the cold store in the place where hostages had been taken. But the terrorists themselves claimed, of course, that their actions were inspired by their faith. However warped or perverted people think their interpretation of Islam might be. And the Paris attacks were not, unfortunately, the most murderous of their kind in recent weeks. Here's our Adam.
Western Europe is in shock after 3 days of terror in Paris that left 17 innocent people dead and others wounded. The attacks, which claimed the killers had avenged the Prophet Muhammad. And across the globe, terror continues to be carried out in the name of Islam. In Nigeria, Amnesty International says as many as 2,000 civilians died after the Islamist terror group Boko Haram attacked the town of Baga. Nigerian officials say the militants have used a 10-year-old girl as a suicide bomber. In Pakistan last December, the target was a military school. 152 people, 133 of them children, were killed and more than 120 were injured after an attack carried out by the Pakistani Taliban. And in Syria and Iraq, the group known as Islamic State continues to wreak havoc. Only this week, IS was said to have killed 30 Kurds in northern Iraq, while the group was also blamed for double suicide bombings in Lebanon earlier this week.
The grim death toll of recent terrorist atrocities. But can religion really be blamed for the violence, or are other more important factors at play? Here to discuss that, the scientist and atheist Richard Dawkins and the French-born journalist Nabila Ramdani, who is a Muslim, and of course we have the Anglican priest Charles Fraser here as our guest of the day. Is it violent Islam that's causing us problems?
Well, it's certainly violent Islam. The question is whether we should blame religion generally, and I think that would be unfair to do so. At least we need to make a clear distinction between blaming religion in the sense of a state of mind that some people have, and blaming religion in the sense of blaming individuals who happen to be religious. And I think has been a very unfortunate tendency for people to blame Muslims generally for what's done in their name. But I think there is no doubt that it is done in the name of Islam, albeit some will argue that it's a perverted form of Islam.
You believe that at this stage in its development, Islam is more violent than most other religions?
I think that's a very sustainable position, yes.
What do you say to that?
Well, I think superficially the reason for the attacks in Paris was, of course, religion. You had a group of radical Islamists who believed that their God had been blasphemed against, and they set out to murder those responsible. But, you know, and we see the same kind of motivations with all kinds of organised violence, including atrocities perpetrated by groups like Boko Haram. But I think the use of religion to murder and indeed destroy is part of humanity and a human history, and we've seen that go on and on. But it doesn't mean that religion is intrinsically at fault, or is it at fault per se. I believe the opposite, actually. I think it just means that religion plays an important part in people's life, in some people's lives, and they use it as a dynamic for a happy, fulfilled life in the vast majority of cases, and it can be used for terrorism by a minority.
All right, hold on, let me get a reaction to that.
I think the only thing I would say to that, I mean, I agree with it largely, but I would say this, that religion is one of those states of mind which enables people to hide behind a blind faith, which is unarguable with. People can say, my faith tells me to do this. Now, of course, the vast majority of people who hold the same faith don't do that. But it's hard to find anything other than religion. Patriotism is a possibility. Anything other than religion which will cause somebody, an otherwise decent person, to do atrocious things.
What about the Nazis?
Exactly.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's why religious. I said patriotism. Or in this case,
extreme nationalism.
Extreme nationalism.
That's precisely my view. My view is that any manifestation of humanity, be it capitalism, nationalism, or indeed socialism, right down to sport, can be used as a justification to kill people. And in fact, the most devout, sincerely devout people tend not to believe that violence is the answer to sort out the problem. On the contrary, and the real murderous, violent movements, such as Nazism or indeed communism, were actually secular movements.
Of course. what's your view on this? There was a time when Christianity was regarded as a violent religion.
Oh, it has terrible history.
But it isn't so much now, if at all, except in perhaps small parts of the world. Is that because it's at a different stage of development from Islam?
I don't know about the development stuff. I mean, I think it's true that religion has a pretty checkered history, and it has blood on its hands. I mean, one of the things I think about that is that religion has developed a sort of self-critical vigilance, and those religions that know that they have that history and that past are sort of really interrogate themselves. And I think that's really important. That's what theology, I think, is for, to distinguish between good religion and bad religion. And generally speaking, bad religion is religion that get people to kill each other. And I think that's an absolutely essential difference.
So what is it about Islam at the moment that it seems on its edges to be responsible for so much of this?
Well, I don't think it's actually about Islam per se. I think it's about, I think it's a geopolitical thing, and I think that you can't just talk about this as if it's a religious phenomenon. I think what's going on here can't be discussed without talking in France about the Algerian War. It can't be discussed without talking about the Iraq War and Afghanistan.
The Algerian War ended 50 years ago.
It did, but I mean, the legacy of those things is actually very, very present to a lot of people living around the periphery. I mean, this is not something that it's ancient history. I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to get religion off the hook. I'm actually trying to say that actually religion sucks in all other questions of politics and identity, which can themselves be the sort of animating force for violence and aggression.
But the striking thing about the attacks, whether it's 7/7, whether it's the Charlie Hebdo attacks or Boko Haram in Nigeria, is that those doing it give a religious justification, which makes them different from the IRA, which never just used the Catholic Church as a justification for doing it.
There's no doubt that they themselves were motivated by religion. I would actually lump...
They themselves, you mean the Islamists?
Yes. I would actually lump Nazism and similar things in with religion in the sense that these are ideologies where people are not required to justify it rationally.
It's a zealotry.
It's a zealotry. It's an ideological zealotry, which is not vulnerable to rational discourse, not vulnerable to rational argument.
You know, going back to good and bad religion, and, you know, of course people who have been, like the gunmen, recruited by Al-Qaeda, which sadly has become a byword for Islam, they would say that they represent Islam, wouldn't they? But in actual fact, when you look at the profile of the gunmen, they didn't pray, they drank alcohol, they did drugs, you know, they had girlfriends outside marriage and all sorts of things.
Would you be saying that religious people are being hypocritical?
I'm saying they're manipulating religion.
I mean,
in contrast with that, look at the Malian-born gentleman who saved Jews in the kosher shop.
Of course. No, I mentioned that in the introduction. Of course, but
and sadly, what is happening...
This isn't about people who are Muslim. This is about Islam we're talking about. Which
this is about the manipulation of Islam.
Of course, but it seems to be by a large number of people. What do you think when you hear it said that Islam is a religion of peace?
Well, I'm very sceptical of that. I mean, in its history, it's never been a religion of peace. Of course, individual Muslims are mostly peaceful people, but the ideology itself is founded in war. It was spread by war.
No, I firmly disagree.
Well, let me ask you: if Islam is a religion of peace, why is it that you take your life into your own hands if you criticise it?
But as I said earlier, that's the manipulation and the use of religion by a tiny minority.
I mean, the media says what it likes about Christianity and about some other religions too. It doesn't end up facing the barrel of an AK-47. If you do that about Islam, the chances are you might.
No,
correct?
You
can't say
no,
it
incorrect.
happened.
But let me answer that. What is happening in my home city of Paris at the moment is you have politicians who are desperately trying to equate Islam with terrorism. This is not only preposterous, but it's not supported by evidence.
Well, the French government's not trying to do that.
It is.
The French government is.
Absolutely.
When has Monsieur Hollande said that Islam equals terrorism?
You have not the French government. I'm saying politicians in France, including the National Front.
Well, the National Front, of course, is ranking. Well, when has
politicians in France? I said, including members of the National Front who already.
When has the UMP said that in France?
The UMP, have you not been aware of the legacy of Sarkozy equating...
When has Mr. Fillon said that, the current leaders of...
But they've spent all their time in power equating Islam with the internal threat in France, portraying it as the alien enemy within.
I mean, this is, you know, in the land of liberty is that the burqa is banned and so forth. I mean, what sort of liberty is it when...
So are crosses in French schools. This is part of the French secular tradition.
And the French problem with this French secular tradition is this, that it was aimed at, originally, at the Catholic Church, which was powerful and strong and could have done with a good kicking, OK? But now the people that it aims their ire at are not actually the powerful sitting in palaces in Rome, but actually poorer people all around the world. And actually it turns I mean, some of the problems with some of the cartoons with Charlie Hebdo is they were actually not on the side of the powerless against the powerful, but the other way around. And that's a very, very big difference.
What we've been arguing about this morning is not whether that's right or wrong, but whether it should lead to violence.
No, we're not arguing about that. We all agree on that. There's no arguing about that.
No, but what
one
we're
around this
discussing is there
arguing
a
that.
strain of modern Islam which encourages, facilitates this kind of violence?
The answer is no. Islam is not like that. I mean, I just think
the greatest fallacy, you were talking about secularism in France, the greatest fallacy is that politicians have come to manipulate this concept to mean the stifling of expression of religious belief. It is the exact opposite.
Richard Dawkins, I'll give you
We need to
final
make
word.
a distinction between what the terrorists themselves believe, what other Muslims believe, and what Islam itself teaches.
But you don't think we're doing that?
Well, I think we need to do that. I also think we need to wait for opinion polls among Muslims generally about what they actually think about this. Opinion polls on 7/7 and 9/11 were not encouraging.
All right, we need to leave it there, I'm sorry. No, unlike France, Britain isn't a secular state. Anglican bishops sit in the House of Lords, and the Church makes regular forays into British domestic politics. But is the Church of England too political, even partisan on occasions? Here's our new religious affairs correspondent, Adam, again.
St Paul's Church in Salford, part of the patch watched over by the Bishop of Manchester. Recently, David Walker has spoken out on all sorts of issues, from the footballer Ched Evans to immigration.
For 2 centuries, those who've come to Manchester from different and diverse backgrounds have added to the excitement of the city, the entrepreneurship of the city, the economic growth of the city. And so when I hear politicians or others saying that migration is universally a bad thing, that it's destroying our economy, that it's making life worse for indigenous people, then if that is not true, if I don't feel the facts bear that out, then that's a subject on which I've spoken out on several occasions.
He was also part of this campaign last year, where 27 Church of England bishops wrote an open letter saying that changes to benefits were forcing people to use food banks. It was organised by this Manchester-based charity called Church Action on Poverty and was criticised by ministers who said the campaign was too political.